The incident at the mall. The sun was high above, casting its warm light through the large windows of the Greenridge Mall. Inside, the usual hum of shopping activity echoed through the air, with people moving between stores, chatting with friends, and enjoying their weekend routines. The buzz of a busy mall was a comfort to many, a familiar noise, a backdrop to the mundane errands of everyday life. But on this day, that atmosphere was shattered by a single, brutal act. In the middle of the food court, where the sweet scent of cinnamon rolls mixed with the savory aromas of fast food, a police officer's fist collided with the fragile face of an elderly woman. The crack of the punch was sharp, echoing like a gunshot through the bustling crowd. The woman, Martha Anderson, staggered backward, her knees trembling, but somehow, she remained standing. Her frail form seemed to defy the force of the blow, holding her ground despite the obvious pain radiating from her face. For a moment, the entire mall froze. Ethan Blake, the officer responsible for the punch, stood with his chest heaving. His face was hard, the sharp edges of his features contorted into a sneer. The smugness in his eyes made it clear that he believed he was in control of the situation, as if this was just another incident in his daily routine. His hand remained clenched, ready to strike again if necessary. But Martha did not yield. Despite the sting of the blow, she stood tall. Her eyes, clouded with pain, locked onto Ethan's, unflinching. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. Her gaze was filled with a quiet, yet fierce defiance, a small but undeniable flame of resistance that was impossible to ignore. The crowd, initially stunned into silence, slowly began to stir. Phones were raised, capturing the moment. Whispers spread like wildfire, "Did you see that? A cop just hit an old woman." But no one moved to intervene. They stood frozen, unsure whether they should act or stay silent, caught between fear and the desire to witness an injustice unfold. Ethan's voice broke the silence, his words dripping with disdain. "This is what happens when you don't follow the law," he spat, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "Respect authority, or you'll end up like her." Martha's voice trembled, but there was a power in her words that commanded attention. "That boy did nothing wrong," she said, her voice growing louder, filled with the strength of a woman who had seen too much injustice in her life to stand idly by. Her words were not just a defense of the young man Ethan had accosted, they were a declaration of defiance against a system that too often ignored the humanity of people like her. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, voices filled with disbelief. People were beginning to realize that this wasn't just another altercation. This was a moment that would not be ignored. But it wasn't until the heavy sound of firm footsteps broke through the tension that things began to shift. The crowd parted, and a tall, imposing figure stepped into the food court. His presence was commanding, his posture unyielding as he walked toward Martha. He was dressed in an immaculate suit, his face set with determination, and his eyes were filled with an unshakable resolve. His name was Lucas Anderson, Martha's son. The reaction of the crowd was instantaneous. Whispers rippled through the mall. "Is that Lucas Anderson?" "The human rights lawyer," one person murmured, eyes wide with recognition. Ethan's confident smirk faltered as his eyes locked with Lucas's. The color drained from his face, and instinctively, he took a step back. His hands, once clenched in anger, now hung limply at his sides as a wave of fear washed over him. "Mom," Lucas's voice rang out, deep and authoritative, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Are you all right?" Martha's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "Lucas, you came just in time," she said, her voice filled with pride, yet tinged with exhaustion. Lucas turned to face Ethan, his expression cold and unwavering. "You just assaulted an elderly woman without cause," he said, his tone sharp and precise. "And now, you're going to answer for it." Ethan took a step back, his chest tightening. The bravado that had once defined him was quickly evaporating, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He stammered, trying to explain his actions, but his words were weak. "She was interfering with my work," he muttered, his voice lacking the usual menace. Lucas's gaze remained unyielding. "The only thing you're guilty of is abusing your power," he said, his voice firm, a quiet storm of righteousness. "And we won't let it go unnoticed." The crowd, which had been simmering in silence, suddenly came alive. Some people began chanting, their voices rising in unison, "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Phones that had been recording the incident now streamed it live, spreading the story across the internet at an alarming rate. The pressure was building, and Ethan knew that this was no longer just an altercation between him and an elderly woman. It was something far bigger, a battle that he was no longer in control of. He glanced nervously around, his eyes darting from the growing crowd to Lucas's calm, composed figure. The weight of his actions was sinking in, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks: he had crossed a line that could not be erased. Lucas stood tall, resolute, knowing that this was just the beginning. His mother had taught him that standing up to injustice wasn't about winning a single battle, it was about never backing down, no matter the cost. "Did everyone get this on video?" Lucas asked, his voice ringing out with purpose. The crowd responded with a resounding chorus of agreement. Phones continued to stream the events live, broadcasting the truth to anyone who would listen. Lucas could feel the tide shifting, the momentum building, and he knew that this was no longer just about his mother or even Ethan. This was about a system that had allowed abuse of power to go unchecked for far too long. Ethan's face turned pale as he realized that the small, seemingly insignificant moment had snowballed into something far beyond his control. But it was too late to turn back now. He had made his choice, and he would soon learn that choices like these had consequences far more severe than he could have ever imagined. Martha, though bruised, still stood tall, a silent symbol of the strength that ran through her veins. She had lived through decades of injustice, and now, with the arrival of her son, she knew that the fight was far from over. But this time, they weren't alone. The people were watching, and they were ready to demand accountability. In that moment, with the echoes of justice ringing in the air, a new chapter was about to unfold. One that would not be easily forgotten. The call for justice. The echo of Lucas's words hung in the air like the tense silence before a storm. The mall, once buzzing with activity, had transformed into an arena where a profound battle between right and wrong was unfolding in real time. The growing crowd around Ethan Blake and Martha Anderson stood still, some watching with uncertainty, others with the quiet determination to see justice done. As the moment stretched on, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The eyes of the public were now on Ethan Blake, the officer whose actions had sparked this wave of righteous outrage. No longer was he the man in uniform commanding authority. He was just another person facing the consequences of his abuse of power. But for Lucas Anderson, this was just the beginning. He took a step forward, his voice rising to address the crowd. "You're witnessing something that happens all too often, but today, we stand together. Today, we make it clear that the law does not give anyone the right to harm another human being." His words resonated deeply with those around him. Many had been bystanders to injustices like this before, too afraid, too indifferent to act. But this time, with the powerful figure of Lucas Anderson leading the charge, they felt a shift, an undeniable call to action. "I want all of this recorded," Lucas continued, his tone resolute. "The truth will come out, and no matter how much they try to silence us, we will make sure that everyone knows exactly what happened here today." The crowd buzzed, some nodding in agreement, others murmuring under their breath. People pulled out their phones, recording and streaming the moment live to social media platforms, ensuring that Ethan's actions would be broadcast to the world. In this age of instantaneous information, there was no room for him to hide. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in the face of Lucas's unflinching confidence. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a look of fear that spread across his face like a slow poison. He glanced nervously at the crowd, realizing too late that he had underestimated the gravity of the situation. His mind raced as he tried to grasp at some way to reclaim control, but the reality of the situation was clear: he had just assaulted a defenseless woman, and now the whole world was watching. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached the mall. Blue and red lights flickered outside the windows, signaling the arrival of backup. It wasn't just the police who had responded, it was the weight of the entire system that was about to be called into question. The sirens were a signal, but not of rescue. They were the harbingers of a reckoning that would be felt far beyond the mall's walls. Ethan quickly stepped back, trying to regain some semblance of authority. But the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew that his actions would now be scrutinized like never before. The footage from the crowd was already making its way online, and soon, the story would spread far beyond the confines of the mall. There was no turning back now. As the police officers entered the scene, the atmosphere shifted yet again. Their uniforms seemed to hold a different weight than usual, heavier, as if the badge they wore had become a symbol of something much more complicated than it had been moments earlier. They were no longer just the enforcers of law. They were potential participants in a larger, more volatile story that was rapidly unfolding. Among the officers, one figure stood out, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression. He was Deputy Chief Ronald Carter, a man who was known in the precinct for his cold and calculating demeanor. His reputation was built on his ability to manage situations with authority, but also with a ruthlessness that left no room for weakness. He surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, taking in the crowd, the anger, and the tension in the air. As his gaze fell on Ethan Blake, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The once proud officer was now standing in the center of a storm, and Carter knew that the consequences of his actions would ripple far beyond this one incident. "Ethan," Ronald's voice was low, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "What happened here?" Ethan tried to explain himself, his words coming out in disjointed sentences. "She was interfering, he wasn't following orders. I had to take control." Lucas, still standing beside his mother, scoffed at Ethan's pathetic attempt to justify the assault. "You're trying to hide behind excuses now, Blake. There's no excuse for what you did. You didn't just break the law, you violated the most basic human decency." Ronald glanced at Lucas, his expression unreadable. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by a cold mask of indifference. "You've got a lot of nerve, Anderson," he said, his tone cutting. "You're a lawyer. You should know better than to make a scene like this." Lucas's response was sharp and unwavering. "This isn't a scene, Ronald. This is reality. You've allowed people like Blake to abuse their power for far too long. And I'm not going to let you cover it up." The deputy chief's face tightened, a muscle in his jaw twitching as he looked at the growing crowd. The cameras, the phones, the online chatter, it was clear to him now that this wasn't just another incident to sweep under the rug. This was going to be a problem. A big one. "Take them in," Ronald said coldly, gesturing to the officers around him. "We'll handle this at the station." With that, Martha and Lucas were escorted out of the mall, their wrists bound in cold, unforgiving handcuffs. Martha held her head high, her gaze unwavering, her sense of purpose stronger than ever. Her resolve had been tested before, and she knew that no handcuffs could shackle the strength of her spirit. As they were led to the police car, the crowd followed, some shouting words of support, others demanding justice. The sirens wailed again, now joined by the cries of people who were no longer willing to accept the injustices they had witnessed for far too long. Inside the police car, Lucas sat beside his mother, his mind racing. The weight of what had just transpired was heavy, but it was also motivating. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, this was about a system that allowed these kinds of abuses to thrive unchecked. And Lucas knew that if anyone could expose the truth, it was him. "Mom," Lucas said, his voice low but steady. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. We won't let them silence us. Martha, still calm despite the circumstances, nodded. You've always known what to do, Lucas. I trust you. The car pulled into the police station, and the doors swung open. They were led into the holding area, where the usual sounds of activity seemed strangely muted. Officers glanced at them as they passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They recognized Lucas's name. They knew who he was, and they knew that whatever was happening now was about to shake the foundation of their little world. In the sterile, dimly lit interrogation room, Lucas and Martha were left alone to wait. Their minds, however, were already working. Martha's eyes remained focused, unwavering, as she sat across from her son, the years of activism and resistance fueling her every thought. Lucas sat beside her, quietly analyzing the situation. He had already begun to formulate a plan, a strategy for how to take this fight to the next level. The door to the room swung open, and Ethan Blake walked in. His face was twisted in a mixture of arrogance and nervousness, and his presence only added to the already tense atmosphere. He stood across from Lucas and Martha, his eyes narrowing as he tried to assert some semblance of control. What happens now? He sneered, his voice dripping with spite. You think this is going to change anything? Lucas met his gaze, unwavering. You just made a mistake, Blake. And now, we'll make sure the world knows about it. The fight for justice had only just begun. The walls of corruption. The sterile walls of the police station seemed to close in on Lucas and Martha as they sat in the interrogation room, their wrists still bound by cold, unforgiving handcuffs. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the floor. Outside the room, the sounds of the station continued, low murmurs, footsteps echoing down the hall, a steady hum of routine. But within these four walls, a storm was building, one that would shake the very foundation of a corrupt system. Lucas had always known that his mother's fight for justice wouldn't be easy. He had watched her stand against the forces of injustice for as long as he could remember, her tireless work, her unyielding commitment to the truth. Martha Anderson had faced countless battles in her life, some of them physical, others more insidious. But each time, she had emerged stronger, with her resolve never wavering. And now, it was Lucas's turn to carry that torch forward. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the door to the interrogation room opened again. This time, it was not Ethan Blake entering. It was someone far more powerful, Deputy Chief Ronald Carter. Ronald's tall, imposing figure filled the doorway as he stepped into the room, his presence undeniable. His sharp eyes swept over Martha and Lucas before fixing on the younger Anderson. Ronald had long been a fixture in the city's law enforcement, known for his cold, calculating demeanor. He was a man who operated in the shadows, a puppeteer pulling the strings behind the scenes. If anyone could bury this story and make it disappear, it was Ronald Carter. So, the famous Lucas Anderson, Ronald said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. What do you think you're going to accomplish here, lawyer? Lucas met Ronald's gaze without flinching. There was no trace of fear in his eyes, only the unyielding confidence that had been cultivated over a lifetime of standing for what was right. I'm going to expose the truth, Ronald. And when I do, you won't be able to bury it. Ronald's lips curled into a knowing smile, but there was no humor in it. You really think you can take down the entire system? You're just a lawyer. And your mother, she's nothing more than a meddler who thinks she can change the world. Martha's voice cut through the air like a knife. You're wrong, Ronald. I've spent my whole life fighting for justice, and I'll fight for it until the day I die. You've lived in the shadows for too long, and your time is running out. Ronald's eyes darkened, his smile fading. The mention of Martha's history, her legacy of fighting against injustice, seemed to strike a nerve. He had heard the rumors of her past, a woman who had risked everything in the 1970s to stand up to police brutality, a woman who had been a symbol of defiance and strength for an entire community. But that was a different time. A time he thought was long buried. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? Ronald said, his voice turning icy. You're just one man, and one woman. The system is much bigger than you. You've both made a mistake coming here. Lucas stood up slowly, his posture unshaken. No, Ronald. The real mistake was thinking that the law is something you can control and twist for your own gain. It's people like you that have turned this system into a weapon. But the truth will always find its way out. Ronald stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You think you have the power to change anything? This is my world. I've spent years building it, shaping it, making sure that it stays the way I want it. Your idealism might have worked once, but not here. Not now. There was a long pause as Lucas and Ronald locked eyes. The silence between them was thick with the weight of their opposing views, two men standing on opposite sides of a moral chasm that was too wide to bridge. But for Lucas, this was more than just a personal battle. It was a fight for the countless voices that had been silenced, for the families torn apart by corruption, for the victims who had been denied justice for far too long. Martha broke the silence, her voice calm but filled with unshakable resolve. You've underestimated us, Ronald. You think that because you have the power, you control the outcome. But the truth is bigger than you. It always has been. Ronald's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. He had underestimated the Andersons, both mother and son. He had thought he could control everything, that he could manipulate people like Ethan Blake to do his bidding, that his network of power and influence would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But the walls were starting to close in, and the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks. You've made a powerful enemy today, Ronald said, his voice low and threatening. And you won't get away with this. Lucas's response was unwavering. The only enemy I've made is the system you've built on lies and fear. And trust me, we won't stop until we've brought it down. Ronald stepped back, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and calculation. He was no longer in control of the situation. The power he had wielded for so long was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. The walls of corruption that had protected him for so many years were beginning to crack, and Lucas Anderson, armed with the truth, was the force that would tear them down. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the police station continued to rise. Ronald had retreated to his office to strategize, but Lucas and Martha remained in the holding room, their minds working in tandem to uncover every possible weakness in the system. The weight of the situation was heavy, but neither of them wavered. Lucas had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, but this was different. This wasn't just about laws and regulations. It was about the very fabric of the justice system itself, one that had been twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. But Lucas wasn't intimidated. He had seen the ugliness of power before, and he knew how to expose it. His thoughts were interrupted when the door to the interrogation room opened once again. This time, it was Ethan Blake who entered, his face still pale, his eyes downcast. He stood in front of Lucas and Martha, his posture stiff and awkward. I didn't mean for this to happen, Ethan mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas didn't flinch, his gaze cold and piercing. You didn't mean for this to happen. You assaulted my mother in front of a crowd, Blake. You knew exactly what you were doing. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling. I didn't know it was going to get this far. I thought I could handle it. But now, I don't know what to do. Martha, who had been quiet until now, looked at Ethan with a mixture of sadness and empathy. You were just following orders, weren't you? You thought you were protecting the system. But the system isn't always right, Ethan. You have to understand that. Ethan looked up at Martha, his expression conflicted. I never thought it would go this far. I didn't think. Lucas's voice cut through the air, firm and unwavering. The truth is, you acted out of fear. Fear of someone who used you, manipulated you, and turned you into an instrument of abuse. But you still have a choice, Ethan. You can make things right. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of guilt and confusion overwhelming him. What do I do now? You tell the truth, Lucas said firmly. You tell them what you know. And you stop being a pawn in a corrupt game. The room was silent as Ethan absorbed Lucas's words. For the first time, he seemed to realize the magnitude of what he had done, and the choice that now lay before him. The path to redemption wasn't clear, but it was there, if he was willing to take it. As the door closed behind Ethan, Lucas and Martha exchanged a look, a shared understanding of the battle that still lay ahead. The wheels of justice were slowly starting to turn, but there was much more to be done. The fight against the system was far from over. And Lucas Anderson was ready for whatever came next. Shattered illusions and the fight for justice. The days following the confrontation at the police station were a whirlwind for Lucas and Martha. The incident at the mall had sparked an outpouring of support from the public. Videos of the assault on Martha by Officer Ethan Blake had spread like wildfire across social media, with millions of people around the world watching in disbelief as the frail woman was struck down without provocation. But what happened next was even more remarkable. The viral footage, combined with the presence of Lucas, one of the nation's most renowned human rights lawyers, had set in motion a series of events that neither the police department nor Ronald Carter could have predicted. Back at their apartment, Martha sat by the window, looking out over the city with a quiet intensity. It was the first moment she had had to herself since the chaos had erupted. Lucas had been pacing, his mind racing as he pieced together the growing puzzle of corruption. He had made countless calls, sent messages to key allies, and set up meetings with reporters, all while Martha, ever the pillar of strength, remained calm in the face of everything that was unfolding. "Mom," Lucas said, stopping in front of her. "We need to be ready. The pressure is going to get worse, and we need to make sure we're not caught off guard." Martha nodded, her eyes still fixed on the view outside. "I've been fighting for justice for a long time, Lucas. This isn't new to me. What's new is seeing you stand with me, and that's what keeps me going." Lucas smiled faintly. His mother had been the one to instill in him the values he now lived by, but it was moments like this that reminded him of just how much she had sacrificed, and how much more she was willing to risk to fight for the truth. They knew the media was already buzzing, and the public sentiment was shifting. What had once been a small incident, a rogue cop taking matters into his own hands, was now the focal point of a larger conversation about police corruption, brutality, and accountability. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. This was about an entire system, built on secrecy, fear, and intimidation. And at the heart of it was Ronald Carter, the deputy chief of police, a man whose grip on the city's law enforcement apparatus was suffocating. But Lucas knew that exposing the corruption was only part of the battle. To bring real change, they would have to navigate a web of deceit that had been carefully constructed over the years. That meant taking on not just the police force, but the power brokers who enabled it, the politicians, the business leaders, the media outlets that had turned a blind eye for so long. Ronald Carter was a key player, but there were others behind him, lurking in the shadows, willing to do anything to protect their interests. As Lucas worked late into the night, strategizing with Jessica Turner and Karen Williams, two of his most trusted allies, Martha found herself reflecting on the years she had spent fighting for change. In the 1970s, during the height of her activism, she had seen the full extent of the injustices plaguing their community. She had marched, protested, and stood face to face with those who had tried to silence her. But nothing had been as insidious as the web of corruption they were now confronting. Back then, the enemy had been clear: the police officers, the political figures, the institutions that perpetuated violence. Today, the fight was more complex, but no less important. Just as she was lost in thought, the phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she knew exactly who it was before she picked up. "Lucas," her voice was steady. "What's going on?" Lucas's voice crackled through the line, urgent but controlled. "Mom, it's worse than we thought. I just got off the phone with Jessica and Karen. Ronald Carter is cleaning house. He's already started to intimidate anyone who might testify against him, including the witnesses from the mall." Martha's heart sank, but her resolve only deepened. "We knew it was coming. What's the plan?" "We need to expose him. The only way to do that is to take everything public. I've got the media ready to run a special on Carter's corruption. But we need the final pieces of evidence. The ones no one can ignore." Martha's breath caught. "What about Ethan Blake?" "That's the problem," Lucas replied. "Ethan's been going back and forth, but he's still too scared of Carter. I think he knows he's in too deep, but he won't speak out unless he feels like he has no other choice. Then we give him no choice." The decision was made. Lucas, Jessica, and Karen worked through the night, gathering everything they could from Karen's time at the police station, leaked emails, secretly recorded conversations, internal reports, and even testimony from officers who had been too afraid to speak out. They had compiled a damning dossier on Carter's criminal empire, one that stretched across the city, touching everything from shady real estate deals to the forced silence of whistleblowers. With the evidence in hand, they knew it was time to act. The next day, Lucas scheduled a press conference, a move that would send shockwaves through the media and the city's law enforcement. But he didn't go alone. Martha, still bruised from her assault, would stand by his side, the symbol of everything they were fighting for. The day of the press conference, the streets outside the courthouse were packed with reporters, cameras, and protesters. The mood was tense but hopeful. People had been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally stand up to the corruption that had plagued their city for years. Lucas stood at the front of the podium, the weight of the moment not lost on him. This wasn't just about Martha or him anymore. This was about the future of their community, the legacy of every person who had fought before them for justice. "We're here today to expose the truth," Lucas began, his voice firm but calm. "For too long, the people in power have manipulated the system, using it to their own advantage, at the expense of our communities. Deputy Chief Ronald Carter, along with his network of corrupt officers, has perpetuated a cycle of violence, fear, and oppression." Martha stood beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd, taking in the faces of the people who had come to witness this pivotal moment. She could feel the weight of her own history, the memories of the countless protests, rallies, and confrontations she had been a part of. But this was different, this was personal. "We've gathered evidence that shows a clear pattern of abuse," Lucas continued, holding up a folder filled with documents. "These aren't just isolated incidents. These are the actions of a man who has abused his power for years, and who will continue to do so unless we stop him." At that moment, the doors to the courthouse opened, and several uniformed officers walked into the crowd, their presence immediate and intimidating. The air shifted, and murmurs spread through the crowd. But Lucas wasn't deterred. He was ready for this. "Do we let corruption rule our city?" he asked, his voice rising. "Or do we fight for the justice that we deserve?" A roar erupted from the crowd. The sound was deafening, people had waited too long for this moment. The officers, standing just a few feet away, remained motionless, clearly unsure of how to react. But it was then that the unthinkable happened. Ethan Blake, the very officer who had struck Martha, emerged from the back of the crowd, stepping into the sunlight for the first time since the incident. His face was pale, his hands trembling. But there was something different in his eyes now, determination. "I'm not hiding anymore," Ethan said, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "I'm ready to tell the truth. Everything Ronald Carter has done. Everything he's asked me to do. It ends today." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lucas's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. The moment had finally arrived. The walls of corruption were beginning to crumble, and the fight for justice was taking a new, unstoppable form. As the media swarmed around Lucas and Martha, capturing every moment, Lucas turned to his mother, his voice quiet but resolute. "This is just the beginning, Mom. We won't stop until Ronald Carter and everyone like him is held accountable." Martha smiled, her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of hope. "I know, son. I know." Together, they had just taken the first step in a fight that would change the future of their city, and of the justice system itself. The unraveling of a system. The moment Ethan Blake stepped forward, confessing his role in the corruption network that had plagued the city for years, the weight of the truth began to settle over everyone present. It was as though a dam had broken, releasing the flood of suppressed secrets, lies, and fears that had been contained within the walls of the police department and the broader system for so long. The crowd around Lucas, Martha, and Ethan buzzed with disbelief, curiosity, and a sense of catharsis. The power dynamics were shifting, slowly, but inevitably. The fight that had started with an assault on Martha Anderson was now spiraling into something much larger, a movement that threatened to engulf those who thought they could remain above the law. As the press conference came to a close, Lucas and Martha were swarmed by reporters, their questions coming fast and furious. It was clear that the public, especially those who had suffered under the systemic injustice for decades, was hungry for change. The names of the officers involved in the brutal suppression of the city's most vulnerable, the accusations against Ronald Carter, and the mounting evidence that Lucas had gathered, it was all finally out in the open. But as they stood there, fielding questions from the media, Lucas knew that the real battle was only just beginning. It wasn't just about exposing the corruption now, it was about ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. The city's legal and law enforcement system, designed to uphold justice, was now the very institution that had to be taken down to protect the truth. Ronald Carter had spent years meticulously building his network, placing loyalists at every level to ensure the system remained impenetrable. The exposure of his corruption was only one piece of the puzzle. What Lucas was about to uncover next would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew about power in their city. Back at their apartment later that evening, Lucas paced back and forth, the strain of the day starting to wear on him. He could still hear the voices of the reporters, the overwhelming sound of applause from the crowd when Ethan had confessed, and the subtle yet undeniable shift in the air when people began to realize the gravity of the moment. The press had made their headlines. But for Lucas, the fight was far from over. "Mom," Lucas began, stopping in his tracks. "We've made it public. Now comes the hard part, actually bringing this system down. The moment the truth gets to the wrong hands, they'll try to bury it. They'll use everything to discredit us." Martha, sitting quietly at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, looked up at him. "You're right," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But Lucas, we've already taken the first step. We've exposed them. And no matter what they do, the truth can't be undone." Lucas sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I know. But the media is already being pressured. They'll try to spin the narrative, put the blame on us, on the people who are brave enough to speak out. We need more than just public sentiment. We need the law to work for us, not against us." Martha stood up slowly, walking over to her son. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've always known the law can be a weapon for good or for bad. But you're right, no system is perfect, not when it's built on corruption. What matters is the fight, Lucas. And I trust that you'll see it through." Her words, as always, were a steady reminder of the purpose they were serving. In her eyes, this fight wasn't just about righting the wrongs of one officer or one department, it was about righting the wrongs of a system that had been built to benefit only a few while oppressing the many. The next day, the city was in turmoil. The video of Ethan Blake's confession, along with Lucas's press conference, had sparked a wave of protests. Demonstrators lined the streets, chanting for justice, calling for accountability, and demanding that the corrupt officers be removed from their posts. Local activists, inspired by the courage of Martha and Lucas, began organizing rallies, sending messages of solidarity in action. But Lucas knew that while the streets were alive with energy, there was still a deeper, more insidious battle to be fought in the courts. And to do that, he needed more than just public support. He needed leverage. Lucas had already reached out to his most trusted allies, Jessica Turner, the investigative journalist whose sharp instincts had already proved invaluable, and Karen Williams, the former police officer who had left the force after witnessing too much corruption in Carter's department. Together, they had compiled the evidence that would be the cornerstone of their case. Later that evening, Lucas met with both women at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. They had decided to keep their meetings private, away from the ever-growing media spotlight. Karen had brought more documents with her, memos, financial reports, and internal documents from the police department. But it was the revelation that came from Jessica's research that sent chills down Lucas's spine. "Lucas," Jessica began, her voice low and serious, "I've been digging into Ronald Carter's history. There's more to him than we realized. Carter has connections that reach far beyond the police force. He has ties to major developers, to politicians, and to businessmen. He's been using his position to amass a fortune, laundering money through fake contracts, and even engaging in illegal land deals. He's been pulling the strings of this city for years." Lucas took a deep breath, his mind racing. "That explains a lot. Carter's been untouchable because he's made himself indispensable to so many powerful people." Karen nodded. "Exactly. He's built a network that, if you pull at the right thread, could bring down a whole web of corruption. But it's dangerous. These people will stop at nothing to protect themselves." Jessica's eyes were hard, determined. "I've spoken to some of my contacts in the media. We can get the story out there, make sure the truth is unavoidable. But we need to hit them hard. And we need to hit them now, before they have time to bury it all." Lucas stood up, his mind set on the path ahead. "We need a plan that's going to make them panic. We need to expose the full extent of Carter's operation, tie him to every shady deal, every illegal transaction, every act of violence. We need to show the world exactly what he's done and what he stands for." "But how do we make it stick?" Karen asked, her brow furrowed. "They're going to fight back, Lucas. They've got resources, they've got power." "We fight back harder," Lucas replied, his voice resolute. "We go public with everything. We make sure that even the people who are trying to cover it up are held accountable. We have the truth on our side, and we'll make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug." As they finalized their plans, Lucas felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, and the road ahead was long and fraught with danger. But with the truth on their side and the power of the people behind them, they had a chance to tear down the walls of corruption once and for all. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Ronald Carter was already aware of the storm brewing. His empire was under threat. Ethan Blake's confession had left a mark, but it was only the beginning. Ronald knew that if the truth about his criminal operations came to light, he would lose everything. His influence, his power, and his position in the city's law enforcement would be irreparably damaged. He had always been one step ahead of everyone, but this time, he was cornered. In his office, Ronald paced back and forth, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. He had already spoken to his closest allies, politicians, businessmen, and even some members of the media who owed him favors. But it wasn't enough. The pressure was mounting from all sides. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he hoped he wouldn't have to use. When the line picked up, he spoke in a hushed tone. "I need help. I can't let this get out of control. Do whatever it takes." The voice on the other end was calm but chilling. "We'll handle it. Just keep your head down and don't make any more mistakes." Ronald put the phone down, staring out the window at the city skyline. He had played this game for years, but now, for the first time, it felt as though he was losing. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere left to hide. Lucas and Martha had made it personal. And this time, Ronald Carter wasn't sure he could survive the truth. The battle for justice had just become a full-blown war. And no one, not even Ronald Carter, could predict how it would end. The final reckoning. As the days unfolded in the wake of Lucas Anderson's press conference, the atmosphere in the city began to feel increasingly electric. What had once been a quiet, simmering anger over systemic injustice had now blossomed into a full-fledged storm, with the entire community rallying for change. Demonstrations erupted across the streets, protesters waving banners, chanting for justice, demanding accountability, and calling for an end to the brutality that had stained their city for far too long. The videos of Ethan Blake's assault on Martha Anderson, his eventual confession, and the growing revelations about Ronald Carter's corrupt network had spread like wildfire, pushing the conversation into the national spotlight. But while the streets buzzed with the fervor of those fighting for justice, Lucas knew that the war had only just begun. With each passing day, the forces aligned against him and his mother grew stronger. The system they were up against had deep roots, and the people at the top, the ones like Ronald Carter, would stop at nothing to protect their interests. And now, knowing the threat they faced, Lucas and Martha prepared themselves for the long, arduous journey ahead. Lucas sat in his office late one evening, the only light coming from the glow of his computer screen as he reviewed more documents. The last few days had been a blur of interviews, meetings, and court filings. He had been working tirelessly to build a case against Carter, a case that would expose not only the police corruption but also the widespread criminal activities Carter had orchestrated under the guise of law enforcement. But with every step forward, the opposition grew more formidable. The phone rang, breaking his concentration. It was a number he recognized, Jessica Turner. He answered quickly. Lucas, Jessica's voice was strained but urgent. I've just received some breaking news. You need to get to the courthouse. It's happening sooner than we thought. Carter's going to make his move. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He had known that the pressure was mounting on Carter, but he hadn't anticipated the response to be so swift. The media had been relentless, and the protests continued to grow louder. But he also knew that Ronald Carter had never been one to back down quietly. The stakes were higher now, and the last thing he needed was Carter launching a counterattack to discredit everything they had worked for. I'm on my way, Lucas replied, standing up and grabbing his coat. Keep me posted. The courthouse loomed ahead, its towering stone walls casting a shadow over the bustling street below. As Lucas arrived, he could feel the weight of history pressing in on him. This was more than just a legal battle, it was a fight for the soul of the city, for the countless victims who had been silenced for years by the corrupt officials who ran it. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Journalists crowded the halls, their cameras flashing as they hurried to capture every moment. The trial was about to begin, what could be the most significant trial in the city's history. Lucas knew that the public's eyes were trained on them, and whatever happened in that courtroom would reverberate for years to come. Martha, always the steady anchor, stood by his side as they made their way through the crowd. Her calm demeanor belied the gravity of the situation, but Lucas could see the deep well of strength in her eyes. She had lived through countless battles before. She had seen the worst of humanity and emerged stronger for it. And now, more than ever, Lucas drew from that same well of strength. When they entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. Everyone knew that this trial was not just about Ethan Blake and his violent actions, it was about the larger system of corruption that had been exposed by the Andersons' bravery. The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Elena Brooks, was already seated at the front, reviewing her notes with a sharp gaze. She had become one of the most vocal allies of the Andersons in their fight for justice, and Lucas trusted her completely. The defense, on the other hand, was led by Ronald Carter's own personal lawyer, a man known for his ability to manipulate the law and sway public opinion. As the trial began, the weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. The first witness was called to the stand, a former officer who had worked under Ronald Carter's command. His testimony was damning, describing how Carter had orchestrated the cover-ups of police brutality incidents, silenced whistleblowers, and manipulated evidence to ensure that the truth never saw the light of day. The officer's words sent ripples through the courtroom, and the crowd gathered outside the courthouse could feel the impact as well. But Lucas knew that the battle wasn't won yet. He had seen how these trials often played out. The moment the evidence stacked against the defendant, the defense would bring in their heavy artillery, the influential figures who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Ronald Carter had already shown how far he was willing to go to maintain his power. And it wasn't long before that moment arrived. Later that afternoon, as the courtroom emptied for a short recess, Lucas received a tip from Jessica. She had uncovered something that sent chills down his spine. Ronald Carter, in a last-ditch effort to protect his empire, had pulled strings behind the scenes to orchestrate a covert operation to intimidate key witnesses, plant false evidence, and discredit the Andersons' entire case. Lucas, Jessica's voice crackled over the phone, "I've just found out. Carter's people are trying to bribe the jurors. They've been trying to plant false witnesses and fabricate evidence. And it's all happening right under our noses." Lucas's blood ran cold. This was the final play. Carter was desperate, and when people like him got desperate, they became unpredictable. "Get me everything you have on this," Lucas ordered. "I'll make sure it gets exposed in court. We can't let him get away with this." He hung up the phone and looked at Martha. She had been watching him closely, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "It's happening," Lucas said, his voice low and grim. "Carter's pulling every dirty trick he can think of to try to win this. But we can't let him. We have to expose him for the fraud he is, no matter what it takes." Martha nodded, her resolve unwavering. "We've come this far. We'll see it through to the end." As the trial continued into the next day, Lucas took the evidence Jessica had gathered and prepared for the fight of his life. With a clear strategy in mind, he called a press conference, inviting the media to hear the explosive revelations about Ronald Carter's behind-the-scenes manipulation. The moment Lucas stepped up to the podium, cameras flashed, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lucas began, his voice steady and commanding, "what I'm about to tell you will expose the true nature of the man behind the corruption and cover-ups that have plagued this city for decades. Ronald Carter, with the help of his allies in the police department and city government, has been manipulating the system to silence those who dare speak the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The journalists in the room exchanged glances, their pens poised over their notebooks. "We've gathered evidence," Lucas continued, showing how Carter has been paying off key witnesses, bribing jurors, and falsifying evidence to protect his empire. "The case against Ethan Blake, the police officer who assaulted my mother, is only the tip of the iceberg. Ronald Carter has orchestrated a network of corruption that has allowed him to control this city with impunity. But no more." The room erupted into questions, but Lucas didn't stop. He laid out the full extent of Carter's criminal activities, unveiling documents, recordings, and testimonies that painted a picture of a man willing to destroy lives to protect his own. "Ronald Carter is not just a corrupt officer. He's a criminal mastermind, and we will not rest until he is brought to justice." As Lucas's words reverberated through the room, the city was on the edge of a monumental shift. The people were rising up, demanding the truth, and the system that had protected the powerful for so long was now crumbling before their eyes. But there was one last fight to be had, the fight in the courtroom, where the battle for justice would reach its final, decisive moment. And Lucas was ready to see it through, no matter what the cost. The final reckoning had begun.